So this last weekend, I casted the first of, I think, what's going to end up being more of these Classic Plus tournaments. Classic Plus, if you haven't really heard, it's basically a format where you create all your decks in Wild, but only using cards that were available in Classic. This means that they come with all the buffs, all the nerfs, all the reworks that have been done to those cards since Classic was released, which obviously has a big impact on Classic as we know it. But with Classic being removed, that's kind of the only option we have right now, at least through the Hearthstone client. So I wanted to really just give my thoughts on the mode, how I thought the tournament went, and look at some of the decks here and speculate a bit on the future of it. So the reason I ended up casting the tournament is I'm a big fan of shaking up formats and deck building restrictions, things like that. If you watched my stream for any amount of time, I used to actually have some days where we would create decks in Wild. We'd allow for the inclusion of Nax cards or GVG cards on certain days, and we just play together on stream, just kind of goofing about, and it was fun. It was fun with those restrictions. It still felt like Nax, like GVG. You remember some of those cards, albeit a bit different with all the changes made to these cards in Wild. I even tried to host a tournament that fell through at one point that had these very goofy deck building restrictions. So I like that kind of thing. With these changes to the cards that we're left with now in this legacy set, I guess you'd call it. I was just very curious to see, how it would be, how it would feel, and I gotta say, it was a ton of fun. I got totally sucked in. When the tournament started out, I was really oblivious to any of the changes that were made, other than the few things I'd seen in passing or from some of those previous stream days. So I would just scan through all the lists, look at the cards, what are the new mana costs, the health values, all that kind of stuff. But as the tournament went on, you started to get a feel for how these decks were performing, what their styles were, how these people were running them, why they constructed them in such a way. And it started to feel like, just a really fresh take on Classic. I won't spoil the winner of the tournament, but they were saying the same thing. It was like new life had been breathed into the format by trying this out, which, was just exactly how I felt. Surprisingly excited by it, and really made me start to think that, this format does potentially have a future. There's a lot of fun to be had in figuring out this new meta. Is it balanced? Is it perfect? Right? Is there going to be cards that are totally broken, or classes that are unfun or unplayable or whatnot? Who knows? I think that'll take some time to figure out. People are really going to have to dive in, find what kind of works and what doesn't. But for one, it's going to take some time to do that. And number two, we're already, with this first tournament, just coming up with our own rules. So if there ends up being one card or one class that's really problematic, you could always get rid of that or tweak it in some way going forward. So there's a lot of potential here. Now with that, I wanted to take a look at some of the particular lists that were in that tournament, and just talk about how they performed and relate it back to the changes in that format. So I want to start here with HDA's Paladin. So Paladin had a lot of changes as a whole. I would say in all the updates we've seen to classic cards, really control archetypes have an immediately obvious buff. Things that were expensive or maybe hard to get to because the early game was weak are now enhanced, or it's just earlier to get to those points, sometimes very much substantially. So we're seeing things like a 3 mana Consecration, 3 mana Hammer of Wrath. 3 mana already just a weird spot in Classic. Usually a lot of decks would struggle to actually fill that mana spot. It was like Earthen Ring Farseer would be dropped into a number of decks. It's just it's kind of across the board okay, but a lot of weakness until you got up to 4 mana, and then it was very, very bloated. And Paladin was a perfect example of that. So bloated at 4 mana, but very, very difficult to get there without taking a ton of damage first. You see Holy Light is recovering more mana. True Silver's been buffed. It now heals 3 health every time you swing. So another thing that I noticed is a lot of cards that were already very good got further buffs. And I'm guessing that's because Blizzard wanted to keep some of these cards that were standard in the old days of Hearthstone, still relevant in Wild, in Standard going forward. So some of the bigger, better cards got buffs to stay relevant. But because so many of them got buffed, it really didn't, at least in this first tournament, feel like anything was a total standout above the rest. We see stuff like Cairn with the buff. Already one of the best, arguably the best legendary in Classic, actually got a buff to its attack, but a lot of things got buffs to their health. So yeah, stuff like that, pretty interesting. Guardian of Kings, huge buff, right? Taunts, it's got more health as well. But what was really interesting is we saw this list that HDA brought really, really control heavy. You see, oh, well, control's got a buff. Let's invest super, super hard into the control side of things. And then from Solid, we saw something a little bit different. Still a lot of these control-y cards. You see the Black Knight now down at 4 mana, which actually didn't perform very well in the tournament, surprisingly. Big Game Hunter, I'd have to say the same for. A buffed Azure Drake as well. But yeah, some of those elements, but along with a lot of those mid-rangey cards. You know, Sword of Justice, kind of popular in a mid-range Paladin if you were ever going to play it in Classic. But if the games are going to go longer, better chance that you get a lot of value out of those cards. Defender of Argus even received the buff, but something it does well if you can secure some stuff in the early game on the board. So a couple different takes on Paladin, and what we actually saw was in HDA's Control Paladin, actually too much, going too heavy into the control side of things, and some of those cards becoming useless. You know, Lay on Hands actually becoming a liability because you didn't need that much card draw. The heal wouldn't have really even had an impact. And something like this that's, yeah, a little more mid-range, a little more minion heavy, performed very, very well. Both decks did do quite well. Again, trying to avoid spoilers as much as I can. Yeah, both decks did do quite well. And Paladin as a whole really did quite well. So I think it has a lot of potential to be one of the better classes, at least early on. Seems like, yeah, maybe in the running for the best class even. Really, really interesting, but it did seem pretty obvious to lean towards those control buffs and go for those kinds of archetypes. Along those lines, we saw Priest. I just took Solid's Priest here. It was a good one. We saw another one that was, yeah, a little more mid-rangey. I think it was messing around with the combo of Inner Fire and, was it Stormwind Knight, the Charger? There was like one-ofs in there, and even it did pretty good. But substantial buffs. Holy Nova having its mana cost reduced by 2. Once again, slotting right into that 3 mana spot. Does not hit the enemy hero anymore. Kind of in line with Holy Smite, which, yeah, one of our players kind of learned mid-game. Does not target face anymore, but does actually do better at clearing the board, which is usually what you want the card for anyway. Lower mana cost, Shadow or Death, Thought Steal as well to get a bit more of that draw. Temple Enforcer, a couple changes in its mana cost and attack, but overall a buff, you know, now being able to play it at the 5-drop spot. So you actually see Priest being able to be proactive, right? Getting minions down and then securing the board with the Holy Nova, as opposed to getting almost nothing on the board and hopefully surviving until you get to that 5 mana on the Holy Nova, or maybe an Akanai Circle on 4. The other priest list, which I don't have up here, was even heavier into minions, so like Amani Berserker at the 2-drop spot. And again, kind of just different takes. Do you go more on the control side of things, a little more mid-rangey? Hard to say exactly what's going to be good, and you know, anything is only as good as other decks allow it to be. So it's very possible that if people lean heavy into these buffed control archetypes, well, maybe a mid-range deck comes in that performs very well against them, and that becomes a staple in a tournament lineup. Really just a lot to figure out, but I wanted to highlight these two in particular because they were classes that I think were considered either meh, right? In the case of Paladin, I think there were some decent Paladin lists, but overall felt pretty underwhelming. And Priest, which felt very underwhelming in Classic. Suddenly, I think they're very, very strong classes, at least at the onset and from what we saw. So a bit exciting. And from the two of them, going back to what I was saying about the format as a whole, they still felt like classic decks. You know, you still had the same feeling of playing Paladin, the same feeling of playing Priest. You know, it is this weird thing where Paladin's got all the heals and Priest has very few. Seems a little backwards as far as class identity. But it just felt like what you wanted to get out of those classes. You know, if you were someone who was considered a Priest main, a Paladin main, you were always waiting for like the next expansion. Will Blizzard just make this type of thing a bit better? Will they just, you know, give me a bit more early game or some more tools to deal with aggression, whatever the case may be. And now it feels like they're there, but still maintaining that same identity, just with a bit more strength. So it was very, very cool to see these two shine. I specifically picked this Shaman to illustrate one final point. I felt like this deck was very interesting because it didn't really take into account, I didn't think anyway, too many of the changes that came with Classic. You know, looks like a pretty standard mid-range Shaman. But Shaman went through a ton of changes as well. So Rockbiter's getting more expensive, which a lot of people have all kinds of thoughts on. Definitely hurts the class in some way, but other stuff getting very, very good. So Feral Spirit only overloading 1 mana. Lightning Storm only overloading 1 mana. Both of these a huge deal. But here you'll see as well, Lightning Storm no longer with the range of 2 to 3 damage. It's so nice that you don't have to worry about that low roll. You may be familiar with this if you played anything beyond Classic, but Shaman also has lost the Spell Power Totem. It's replaced with a Strength Totem, which is going to go ahead and buff some of your minions' attack by 1. And that's kind of in line with this change, you know. A lot of times you're rolling for spell power, hoping for that 1 in 4, depending on what you've got on the board, and then now the 50-50 isn't such a big deal when you go to play the cards. So removing a lot of that RNG I thought was very, very nice. Obviously the buffs to Drake that we looked at before, just some substantial staples in Shaman. Fire Elemental as well, now dealing 4 damage, in line with just buffing very, very good cards. Alakir here as well, buffed a little bit. So seeing that, you feel like, well, mid-range Shaman was very good in Classic. Surely it will be good in this new format. We only got a small glimpse of it, but it didn't really perform that well. And it gave this feeling of, yeah, I don't really know where it's going to fit in this whole new format. If we keep going with it, I think it's got the potential to be very good against those control lists that we just looked at. You know, mid-range Shaman was always very good at dealing with, say, a control druid, a control warrior. Now maybe it's going to be looking at something like, yeah, control priest and control paladin instead. But it did feel a little bit underwhelming in the matchups that we saw. So the thing that I really wanted to illustrate here was, from looking into the Discord and hearing people talk about this format, I think a lot of people presented this idea of, well, looking at the changes, it's very obvious that this class or this deck is going to stand above the rest. Format solved. All right, haven't played a game, but the format is solved. And one of those decks was Freeze Mage. Freeze Mage looked very similar to what Freeze Mage looked like in Classic. Couple little tweaks, and same sort of idea with this mid-range Shaman. It's pretty much the same thing. It'll be great now. We saw Freeze Mage perform terribly in the tournament, like awful. It really did just have a terrible win rate, and most people brought the lists to the tournament. But again, it's sort of, you make these assumptions. I think I mentioned it during the cast. You would see it with every new expansion that came out. Popular streamers and people online, you go to Reddit, whatever it is, they look at the new set of cards and they speculate this is going to see a ton of play, these cards are going to be terrible, and of course you get some of them right, but a lot of those assumptions completely off base, right? There were cards that were pronounced dead on arrival that became staples in tons of decks, and the total opposite. It's like, you better craft this on day one, and then you never play the card ever again. It's just total trash. So I think we're seeing a bit of that just in the early onset of this Classic Plus format. That speculation already being turned on its head a bit. I don't think it's even close to a solved format. Not anywhere near there. I think there's going to need to be a lot of experimentation, and there's a lot of room to figure out, what would a meta in this format look like. So, finally, I just wanted to talk about kind of going forward, what will I speculate this looks like, what might be good, what might not be good. I think it's a big mystery right now, and because you don't have the ladder to test things, you either got to be really diligent in Discord to set up some games, or really good at theory crafting, but we'll really only get to see the true test of all these decks in tournaments for now. And that's where we'll start to get a meta that shakes up a bit. And then finally, those assumptions can kind of come into play. So what I'm seeing just after one tournament, my little bit of speculation, we didn't see too much aggro do very well. Aggro Rogue seemed a bit promising, maybe a bit promising. But aggro as a whole in Hearthstone really was there to keep other decks in check, to make sure you didn't get too greedy. Aggro, the way that it tended to work in Classic, right? Aggro kind of countered mid-range would counter control, and control would counter aggro. I know that that's different than some other card games, the way that it went, but what we didn't see a lot of was, I think, that mid-range countering control. Seems like there's some obvious buffs to these control archetypes. Seems pretty easy to throw something together with some of these classes, like Paladin, like Priest, and even stuff like Warrior. Druid, we saw, even though, again, was pronounced dead on arrival, Druid actually performed pretty well in the tournament. There was some interesting stuff, a lot of different archetypes there. So some good stuff in that area. I think the players that will be the most successful in the next tournament will have found at least one, maybe two kind of mid-rangey decks, whether that's something a little bit like this Paladin that is still kind of controlled, kind of high-end, just with some mid-range tools, or whether that's, lean right into the mid-range archetype, just go hard for that, for something that will counter any of these control decks. I think that's the first step, kind of the first meta shift, meta counter that we're going to see. So be very, very interested to see how this goes going forward. Don't know exactly what's coming, but it sounds like there's some stuff brewing. So if you're interested, pop into the Discord, Classic Hearthstone Discord, of course. Check out what people are talking about. I think we'll see more tournaments, maybe some other ideas, some things to shake things up. Like I said, seen a lot of talk, a lot of speculation. So hope people are going to give this whole thing a shot, even though Blizzard's completely shut down Classic as a game mode. I think there's a lot of potential here to, at the very least, have fun.